Chillicothe, Ohio, 1930s through the 1990s. Walk into any American classroom and you'd find them. Yellow legal pads stacked on teachers' desks, composition notebooks with that distinctive black and white marbled cover, 5 subject spiral notebooks crammed into backpacks, trapper keepers organizing teenage chaos, and on nearly every single one, stamped in simple letters, Mead. At their peak in the 1980s, Mead Corporation wasn't just making paper products. They were defining what American education looked like. The company controlled over 40% of the school and office supply market. Their mills in Chillicothe, Dayton, and Escanaba churned out enough paper to fill every classroom from Maine to California. Over 28,000 employees, $4.3 billion in annual revenue. Mills running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, every single day of the year. Think about that for a second. One company, one brand, shaping how millions of American students learn to write, to organize, to study. Then something went catastrophically wrong. By 2012, those same factory floors sat empty. The iconic Mead name had been absorbed, rebranded, dissolved. The Chillicothe mill that once employed 2,800 workers was reduced to a skeleton crew of 200. Buildings that hummed with machinery for over a century stood silent. $3.8 billion in debt. Assets sold off, piece by piece. A 170-year-old American institution dismantled in less than 2 decades. This is the story of how a pioneering paper empire rose from the forests of Ohio, dominated American education for generations, and was ultimately destroyed by corporate greed, leveraged buyouts, and the brutal mathematics of Wall Street. This isn't just about notebooks and paper. This is about what happens when legacy companies become commodities, when quarterly earnings matter more than century-old relationships, when the market decides your empire is worth more in pieces than whole. Welcome inside the Mead Paper Factory, where America's education supply dream was built, dominated, and destroyed. Dayton, Ohio, 1846. Daniel E. Mead wasn't born into paper. He was born into ambition. At 23 years old, Mead stood in a Dayton law office, freshly certified, ready to build a practice. The son of a farmer from Ross County, he'd clawed his way through legal training with the kind of hunger that comes from watching your parents break their backs on land that barely produced. Law was supposed to be his ticket out. Respectability, steady income, a gentleman's profession. It wasn't enough. Dayton in the 1840s was exploding. Canals brought commerce. Mills brought manufacturing. The Miami and Erie Canal had just opened, connecting Lake Erie to the Ohio River, and suddenly this sleepy town was becoming an industrial hub. Mead saw something his lawyer colleagues didn't. Paper. Every business needed paper. Contracts, ledgers, correspondence, newspapers. And every sheet had to be made by hand, in small batches, by craftsmen who controlled supply and price. The demand was insatiable, the supply was limited, the opportunity was obvious. But Mead wasn't a papermaker. He didn't know pulp from ragstock. What he had was legal training, business acumen, and the ability to spot a market inefficiency. In 1846, he made his first move, not into paper manufacturing, into paper sales. He convinced a small paper mill in the area to let him handle their distribution. He'd negotiate contracts, find buyers, handle the business side. They'd make the paper, clean division of labor. Within 2 years, he wasn't just selling paper. He was obsessed with understanding how it was made. He spent hours in the mills, watching the rag sorters separate cotton from linen, observing the beaters pulverize fibers into pulp, learning the chemistry of sizing and bleaching. Most distributors saw paper as a commodity. Mead saw it as a science that could be optimized, standardized, industrialized. By 1850, at just 27 years old, Mead had saved enough to make his move. He didn't want to sell someone else's paper anymore. He wanted to make it. The problem was simple: capital. Mills required machinery, water power, skilled workers, and raw materials. Mead had the vision, but not the fortune. That's when he met Colonel Ellis. Thomas H. Ellis was everything Mead wasn't: old money, established family, connections that opened doors. But Ellis was smart enough to recognize that money without vision just sits in banks. And Mead had vision. The deal was clean. Ellis would provide capital. Mead would run operations. Equal partnership. In 1856, Mead and Ellis purchased a small paper mill on the Mad River in Dayton. The timing couldn't have been better. 1856, the Mead and Ellis mill started production with 12 employees and 1 paper machine. Most paper mills at the time produced whatever the market demanded that week. Newsprint on Monday, writing paper on Wednesday, wrapping paper on Friday, constantly retooling, constantly adjusting, inefficient and expensive. Mead saw the waste. He implemented something radical for the time: standardization. The mill would focus on specific grades of paper and perfect them: book paper, fine writing paper, ledger stock. Products that required consistency and quality. Products that commanded premium prices. Let the other mills chase every small order. Mead would build reputation through reliability. Here's what made this absolutely brilliant business. Standardization meant longer production runs. Longer runs meant lower costs per sheet. Lower costs meant better margins, even at competitive prices. Better margins meant capital for expansion. By 1860, the mill employed 45 workers. Revenue had tripled. Mead's paper was being shipped to publishers and businesses across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Then, tragedy struck. Colonel Ellis died in 1862. The partnership dissolved. Mead bought out Ellis's heirs and renamed the operation simply Mead Paper Company. He was 39 years old, sole owner. And the Civil War had just created the biggest paper shortage in American history. The war machine consumed paper at unprecedented rates. Military correspondence, government contracts, newspapers hungry for battle reports. Demand exploded while Southern mills shut down and raw materials became scarce. Mead didn't just meet demand, he secured it. While competitors scrambled for rag stock, Mead established long-term contracts with textile mills and clothing manufacturers for their waste fabric. Guaranteed supply, predictable costs, continuous production. Between 1862 and 1865, Mead Paper Company's revenue increased by 380%. The workforce grew to 120. A second paper machine was installed. The mill ran 24 hours a day. But here's the thing about war profits. They're temporary. Mead knew that. So while his competitors pocketed their earnings, Mead reinvested everything into machinery, patents, and raw material contracts that would outlast the war. By 1870, Mead Paper Company had become one of the largest paper manufacturers in the Midwest. But Daniel Mead was 47 now, and he was thinking about something bigger than Dayton. He was thinking about forests, specifically the endless forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. 1880, Escanaba, Michigan. The Upper Peninsula was a papermaker's paradise. Endless white pine and spruce forests. The Escanaba River providing water power and transportation. Rail lines connecting to Chicago and points south. And most importantly, land was cheap. Timber was abundant. Competition was minimal. Daniel Mead was 57 years old. Most men that age were thinking about retirement. Mead was thinking about building the largest paper mill in the Midwest. He spent $180,000, a fortune at the time, on 2,400 acres of timberland and a mill site on the Escanaba River. The gamble was enormous, but the math was simple. Rags for papermaking were getting expensive and scarce. Wood pulp was the future, and Mead was positioning himself at the source. The Escanaba Mill opened in 1881 with state-of-the-art groundwood pulp machinery imported from Germany. While the Dayton Mill continued producing fine papers from rag stock, Escanaba would focus on newsprint and cheaper grades made entirely from wood pulp. Different markets, different products, vertical integration. Here's where Mead proved he wasn't just a papermaker. He was a businessman who understood supply chains. The company purchased its own timberlands, built its own logging camps, operated its own railroads to transport logs to the mill. No middlemen. Complete control from tree to finished sheet. By 1885, the Escanaba Mill employed 340 workers and produced 40 tons of newsprint daily. The Chicago Tribune became a major customer, then the Detroit Free Press, then publishers across the Midwest. Sales climbed, reputation built, and Daniel Mead started thinking about succession. His son, George H. Mead, had grown up in the mills, not as a privileged owner's son, but working the same shifts as everyone else, sorting rags at 14, learning the chemistry of pulping at 16, managing production schedules at 20. By the time George was 30, he knew more about papermaking than most men twice his age. In 1890, Daniel officially made George general manager of both mills. The transition was smooth. Strategic vision passed from father to son, and George had his own ideas about where Mead Paper Company should go next. 1900. George H. Mead stood in a Boston stationery shop watching a frustrated teacher try to organize loose sheets of paper. Education was changing. The one-room schoolhouse was dying. Multi-grade schools were opening across America. More students, more subjects, more writing, and teachers were drowning in loose paper that fell apart, got lost, or became disordered chaos. Students needed a better system. George saw the market before anyone else did. The composition book existed. Cheap paper sewn into a binding with cardboard covers. But they were expensive, fell apart quickly, and came in limited sizes. George envisioned something different. Better paper, durable binding, standardized sizes, produced at scale. In 1902, Mead Paper Company launched its first line of student notebooks. Wire spiral binding, still a relatively new technology. Thick cardboard covers. Paper made in-house, specifically for writing with pencil or pen. 3 sizes: small, medium, and the now standard 8.5 by 11 inches. The price point was key. George knew schools had tight budgets, so Mead notebooks sold for 15 cents, half the price of comparable products. How? Vertical integration. Mead made the paper, the covers, and did the binding. No distributor markups, no middlemen. Within 2 years, Mead notebooks were in schools across Ohio and Michigan. Within 5 years, they'd reached California. But George wasn't satisfied with notebooks. He saw the entire education supply market as opportunity. In 1906, Mead expanded into pencils, erasers, and writing pads. Every product with the same philosophy. Good quality at affordable prices through efficient manufacturing. By 1910, Mead Corporation, the name changed in 1905 to reflect the diversification, employed over 1,800 workers across 3 mills. Revenue exceeded $4 million annually. The company controlled approximately 15% of the school supply market in America. Then George did something audacious. He started buying competitors. 1915 through 1930. This was the age of American industrial consolidation. Carnegie built U.S. Steel. Rockefeller built Standard Oil. George Mead was building a paper empire. Between 1915 and 1925, Mead Corporation acquired 7 smaller paper companies. Not hostile takeovers, strategic purchases. Mills in Indiana, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Each acquisition brought new capacity, new markets, or new product lines. The strategy was ruthlessly efficient. Mead would buy struggling competitors, modernize their equipment, standardize their production, and integrate them into the distribution network. Most of the acquired mills increased output by 40 to 60% within 2 years under Mead management. By 1925, Mead Corporation operated 11 mills and employed over 8,500 workers. The company produced everything from newsprint to fine writing paper to specialized industrial grades. But the education supply division, notebooks, paper, pads, was the crown jewel. That segment alone generated $12 million in annual revenue. At their peak in the late 1920s, Mead products were in 1 out of every 3 American classrooms. The distinctive Mead logo, simple, authoritative, became synonymous with back-to-school season. Think about that for a second. One company, shaping what an entire generation used to learn. George Mead died in 1933 at age 71. He'd grown his father's regional paper mill into a national corporation worth over $50 million. His son, Harry R. Mead, became the 3rd generation to lead the company. And Harry had inherited an empire positioned perfectly for the next boom, World War II. 1942. America was at war, and war required paper. Maps, manuals, correspondence, forms, packaging. The military consumed paper at astronomical rates, and Mead Corporation had the capacity, the expertise, and the government contracts to supply it. Between 1942 and 1945, Mead mills ran at 110% capacity. New shifts added equipment pushed beyond recommended limits. Workers putting in 60-hour weeks. The company produced over 400,000 tons of paper for the war effort, enough to print operation manuals for every soldier, sailor, and airman in the European theater. Revenue exploded. By 1945, Mead Corporation was generating $89 million annually. The workforce had swelled to 14,000. But here's what made Harry Mead different from other war profiteers. He saw past the temporary boom. He knew the war would end, and he knew what would come next, the baby boom. Starting in 1944, before the war even ended, Harry began redirecting profits into expansion. Not just more paper capacity, specifically more education supply capacity, new binding machines, larger warehouses, expanded distribution networks. His bet was simple. Millions of children would be born in the coming years. All of them would need notebooks. He was dead right. 1946 through 1964, 76 million American babies. And by the 1950s, they were filling classrooms at unprecedented rates. School construction boomed. Enrollment exploded, and every student needed supplies. Mead was ready. The 1950s and 60s were Mead's golden age. The company introduced products that became cultural icons. The Mead Trapper Keeper, launched in 1978 but conceptualized in the 1960s. The Data Center Notebook. Reinforced filler paper. Mead's innovations defined how students organized their education. By 1970, Mead Corporation controlled 42% of the school supply market. Over $800 million in annual revenue, 28,000 employees, mills in 15 locations. The company had diversified into paperboard, packaging, and even early computer paper. Continuous feed forms for IBM mainframes. At the Chillicothe mill alone, production had grown so massive that the facility sprawled across 640 acres with 37 buildings, 3,000 workers, paper machines running 24 hours a day producing 1,200 tons daily. Everything was falling into place. Mead seemed invincible. Beneath this success, something sinister was happening. 1978. Wall Street discovered a new game: leveraged buyouts. The concept was simple and devastating. Investment firms could purchase massive corporations using borrowed money, leveraging the target company's own assets as collateral. Once acquired, the new owners would slash costs, sell off divisions, and extract maximum short-term value before reselling or taking the company public. Legacy didn't matter. Workers didn't matter. Long-term sustainability didn't matter. Only the numbers on quarterly reports. Mead Corporation, with its massive landholdings, valuable timberlands, and strong brand recognition, became a target. In 1979, corporate raider Carl Icahn began accumulating Mead stock. His strategy was transparent: force the board to restructure, sell off assets, or face a hostile takeover. Mead's leadership fought back, implementing poison pill defenses and seeking a white knight buyer. They found one. In 1982, Occidental Petroleum, run by Armand Hammer, approached Mead with a merger proposal, not a buyout, a partnership. Occidental wanted Mead's forests and paper capacity. Mead would keep its brand and operational independence. The board, desperate to avoid Econ, agreed. Here's where the story takes a dark turn. The merger was a disaster. Occidental loaded Mead with debt from the acquisition. The company that had carried minimal debt for 130 years was suddenly leveraged at $1.2 billion. Occidental executives, focused on oil and gas, had zero understanding of the paper business. They demanded quarterly profit increases that made no sense in a cyclical industry. Mead's management tried to adapt. They cut costs, reduced workforce, closed smaller mills, but the debt payments were relentless. Every year, $140 million in interest alone. By 1985, Mead Corporation was hemorrhaging money. The company that had weathered the Great Depression and 2 world wars was drowning in Wall Street debt. Then came the fatal decision. 1990, Mead's board made a desperate play: diversify into digital. The logic seemed sound. Paper consumption was declining. Schools were starting to adopt computers. Office paperwork was being replaced by email and word processors. If Mead wanted to survive, it needed to evolve beyond paper. The company spent $680 million, money it didn't have, acquiring LexisNexis, an online legal research database. The idea was to become an information company instead of just a paper company. It was a catastrophically wrong decision. First problem, Mead knew nothing about software, databases, or digital subscriptions. The cultures were incompatible. Paper mills ran on long-term planning and patient capital. Tech companies ran on rapid iteration and venture funding. Management couldn't bridge the gap. Second problem, the acquisition was financed entirely through debt. Mead's leverage ratio hit 4.5 to 1. The company was now paying over $200 million annually just in interest. Third problem, while Mead was distracted by digital dreams, their core paper business was being demolished by competitors who focused on efficiency and innovation. International Paper and Georgia-Pacific, unburdened by tech acquisitions, modernized their mills, cut costs, and captured market share. Mead's education supply division, the crown jewel, started losing ground to cheaper imports and more innovative competitors like Staples' private label brands. By 1995, Mead's share of the school supply market had dropped from 42% to 28%. Revenue was flat, debt was crushing. Stock price had fallen 60% from its 1987 peak. The board panicked. They started selling assets to service debt. The Indiana mills, the Wisconsin facilities, timberlands that had been held for a century. Each sale generated short-term cash but gutted long-term capacity. In 1996, Mead sold LexisNexis to Reed Elsevier for $1.5 billion. The proceeds went entirely to debt reduction. The information company strategy had failed spectacularly. Mead was back to being a paper company, but a weakened, heavily indebted one with outdated mills and declining market share. And the competition smelled blood. 2000. Mead Corporation was 154 years old and on life support. The Chillicothe mill that once employed 3,000 workers was down to 1,200. Buildings sat empty. Equipment that should have been replaced decades ago limped along, breaking down frequently. Production costs were 18% higher than industry average. The company had three choices: invest billions in modernization, find a buyer, or file for bankruptcy. Option 1 was impossible. The debt was still $800 million. No bank would extend more credit. Option 3 would destroy shareholder value and probably lead to liquidation. That left option 2. In 2001, Westvaco Corporation, another struggling paper company, proposed a merger, not because Westvaco was strong, because both companies were weak and Wall Street believed consolidation would create efficiencies. The merger created Mead Westvaco. New name, new management, same fundamental problems. The company immediately announced synergies, corporate speak for layoffs and closures. The Chillicothe mill was consolidated. Employment dropped from 1,200 to 400, then to 200. Production shifted to newer facilities. But the real death blow was still coming. 2008. The Great Recession hit. School budgets collapsed. Office supply demand plummeted. The commercial printing industry, Mead's largest customer segment, was dying as everything went digital. Mead Westvaco's education supply division, hemorrhaging money, was sold to ACCO Brands in 2012 for $460 million. The Mead name was licensed to ACCO for consumer products, but would gradually disappear from packaging. The Chillicothe mill, the heart of Daniel Mead's empire, closed its last production line in 2015. The buildings were sold to a real estate developer who proposed converting them into condos. That never happened. Too expensive, too contaminated, too outdated. In 2016, Mead Westvaco merged with Rock 10 to form West Rock. The Mead name disappeared entirely from corporate documents, from a 170-year-old American institution to a footnote in a conglomerate's history, in less than 15 years. There are lessons in Mead's ashes, brutal lessons about American business in the age of financial engineering. Lesson 1. Debt is a slow poison. For 130 years, Mead operated with minimal debt. The company weathered economic downturns, industry changes, and technological shifts because it had financial flexibility. The 1982 Occidental merger changed everything. Debt eliminated options. Every decision had to prioritize debt service over innovation, over workers, over long-term growth. When you're leveraged 4-to-1, you can't invest in new equipment. You can't ride out market downturns. You can't make patient strategic decisions. You're a slave to quarterly earnings and interest payments. Lesson 2. Don't abandon your core competency. Mead spent 150 years perfecting paper manufacturing. They understood the chemistry, the markets, the customers. Then, in a moment of panic, they bet the company on digital databases, a business they knew nothing about. The LexisNexis acquisition wasn't just expensive, it was a distraction. While Mead's leadership was learning about software subscriptions, International Paper and Georgia Pacific were modernizing mills and lowering costs. By the time Mead refocused on paper, they'd lost a decade of competitive position. Lesson 3. Wall Street and Main Street operate on different timelines. Paper mills require patient capital. Forests take decades to mature. Equipment lasts 30 to 40 years. Customer relationships build over generations. This model worked brilliantly in the age of family ownership and long-term shareholders. It collapsed under leveraged buyouts and quarterly earnings pressure. Wall Street wanted 15% annual returns. The paper industry averaged 6 to 8% over cycles. The math didn't work. So companies like Mead cut costs until they destroyed their own capacity to compete. Lesson 4. Market share built over generations can be lost in years. In 1990, Mead controlled 42% of school supplies. Teachers trusted the brand. Students recognized the logo. Distributors gave Mead premium shelf space. That took 90 years to build. By 2000, market share was 18%. What happened? Mead, focused on debt service and corporate restructuring, stopped innovating, stopped investing in distribution, stopped competing on anything except price. And price-only competition is a race to the bottom. Once you lose trust, you don't get it back. The teachers who bought Mead for 40 years switched to other brands, and their students never learned to trust Mead in the first place. Chillicothe, Ohio. Today, if you drive down Bridge Street, past the shopping plazas and chain restaurants, you'll see it. The Mead Mill Complex. Or what's left of it. Most of the buildings are gone now. Demolished in 2018 when contamination cleanup became more expensive than anyone was willing to pay. A few brick structures remain, structural shells with broken windows and weeds growing through cracks in the loading docks. There's a for sale sign that's been there so long the phone number has faded. 640 acres of industrial wasteland. The real estate listing calls it redevelopment opportunity. But redevelopment requires capital, vision, and a belief that Chillicothe's future is brighter than its past. No one's buying. The workers are gone. Scattered to other industries, other cities, early retirement. The machines were sold for scrap or shipped overseas. The forests that once supplied endless pulpwood are now managed by investment funds that care only about timber yields and quarterly reports. The Mead brand still technically exists. ACCO Brands licenses it for a declining line of notebooks sold primarily in dollar stores. But that iconic logo that once represented American educational excellence now marks the cheapest products on the shelf. From 1846 to 2016, 170 years. From a two-man mill in Dayton to a corporation employing 28,000 across 3 countries. From defining what American education looked like to a ghost brand on clearance notebooks. All that's left is silence. And the lesson: adapt or die, innovate or disappear. Protect your balance sheet or watch Wall Street destroy what took generations to build. The market doesn't care about your 170-year legacy. It doesn't care about the workers who gave their lives to your mills. It doesn't care about the students who filled 1 million notebooks with your name on the cover. The market cares about quarterly returns. And if you can't deliver them, you get dismantled, piece by piece, quarter by quarter, until there's nothing left but empty buildings and faded memories. Welcome to the Mead Paper Factory, where America's education supply dream was built, dominated, and destroyed.